Chapter 32 of Sons of Fire by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. All in honour. It was nearly a month after Lady Emily's appearance at Discombe, and there had been no letter from Geoffrey. Every day had increased Mrs. Warnock's anxiety, and in the face of an ever-growing fear, there had been a tacit avoidance of all mention of the absent son, both on the part of his mother and of Suzette. They had talked of music, of the gardens, of the poor, and of the latest developments in that science of the supernatural in which Mrs. Warnock's interest had never abated, and in which her faith had never been entirely shaken. Once, in the midst of discussing the last number of the Psychical Magazine with Suzette, a sad skeptic, she said quietly, "Whatever has happened, I know he is not dead. I must have seen him. I must have known. There would have been some sign." Suzette was silent. Not for worlds would she have dashed a faith which buoyed up the fainting spirit. Yet it needed but some dreadful dream, she reflected, a dead face seen amidst the clouds of sleep, to change this blind confidence into despair. It was in the evening following this conversation that Suzette was sitting at her piano, alone in her own drawing-room, playing from memory and losing herself in the web of a Hungarian nocturne, which was to her like thinking and music, the composer's learned sequences and changes of key seeming only a vague expression of her own sadness. Her father was dining out, a man's dinner, a dissipation he rarely allowed himself, and Suzette was relieved from her evening task of playing chess, reading aloud, or listening to tiger stories, which had lost none of their interest from familiarity, the fondly loved father being the hero of every adventure. She was glad to be alone to-night, for her heart was full of dread of the news which the next African letter might bring. She had tried to make light of the leader's death, yet she too thought with a shudder of the two young men alone, inexperienced, and one of them, at least, reckless and daring even to folly. That wailing Hungarian reverie, with its minor modulations, seemed to shape itself into a dream of Africa, the endless jungle, the vastness of swamp and river, the beauty and the terror of gigantic waterfalls, huge walls of water, a river leaping over a precipice into a gulf of darkness and snow-white foam. The scenes of which she had been reading lately crowded into her mind and filled it with aching fears. "Suzette!" A voice called to her softly from the open window. She looked up, trembling and cold with an awful fear. His voice, Geoffrey's, a spectral voice, the voice of a ghost calling to her, the unbeliever, from the other side of the world, calling in death or after death to the woman the living man had loved. She rose with a faint scream and rushed to the window, and was clasped in the living Geoffrey's arms on the threshold between the garden and the room. Had she flung herself into his arms in her fear and great surprise, or had he seized her as she ran to him? She could not tell. She knew only that she was sobbing on his breast, clasped in two gaunt arms which held her as in a grasp of iron. "Geoffrey, Geoffrey, alive and well! What delight for your poor mother! Was she not wild with happiness?" she asked, when he released her, after a shower of kisses upon forehead and lips, which she pretended to ignore. She could not begin quarreling with him in these first moments of delighted surprise. He followed her into the room, and she saw his face in the light of the lamp on the piano, worn, wan, haggard, wasted, but with eyes that were full of fire and gladness. "Suzette, Suzette!" he cried, clasping her hands and trying to draw her to his heart again. "It was worth a journey over half the world to find you. So sweet, so fair, all that my dreams have shown me, night after night, night after night. Ah, love, we have never been parted. Your image has never left me. Africa has done you no good. You are as full of wild nonsense as ever," she said, trying to take the situation lightly, yet trembling with emotion, her heart beating loud and fast, her eyes hardly daring to meet the eyes that dwelt upon her face so fondly. "Tell me about your mother. Was she not surprised, happy? I hope she will be a little glad. I haven't seen her yet." "Not seen your mother?" "No, child. A man can't have two lodestars. I came straight from Zanzibar to this house. I came home to you, Suzette." "But you will go to the Manor directly. Your poor mother has been so miserable about you. Don't lose a minute in making her happy." "Lose? These minutes are gold, the most precious minutes of my life. Oh, Suzette, how cruel you were! Why did you drive me from you?" She was in his arms again, held closely in those wasted arms, caught in the coils of that passionate love, she scarcely knew how. He was taking everything for granted, and she knew not how to resist him. She had no argument to offer against that triumphant love. "Cruel, cruel, cruel, Suzette! 2 years of exile, 2 wasted lonely years, years of fond longing and looking back. Why did you send me away? No, I won't ask. It was all in honour, all in honour. My dearest is made up of honourable scruples and delicate sympathies, which this rough nature of mine can't understand. But you loved me, Suzette. You loved me from the first, as I loved you. Our hearts went out to meet each other over the bridge of my violin, flew out to each other in a burst of melody, and we will go on loving each other till the last breath, the last faint glimmer of life's brief candle. Ah, love, forgive me if I rave. I am beside myself with joy." "I think you are a little out of your mind," she faltered. She let him rave. She accepted the situation. Ah, surely, surely, it was this man she loved. It was this eager spirit which had passed like a breath of fire between her and Allen, this masterful nature which had possessed itself of her heart as of a mere chattel that must needs be the prize of the strongest. She submitted to the tyranny of a love which would not accept defeat, and presently they sat down side by side in the soft lamplight, close to the piano which she loved only a little less than if it were human. They sat down side by side, his arm still round the slim waist, plighted lovers. "Poor Allen," she sighed with a remorseful pang. "Has he gone down to Suffolk?" "To Suffolk? He is on the Congo, past Stanley Falls, I hope, by this time." "On the Congo? You have left him quite alone? Oh, Geoffrey, how could you?" "Why not? He is safe enough. He knows the country as well as I. I left him near Kasongo, where he could get as big a train and as many stores as he wanted, though we have done nowadays with long trains, armies of porters, and a mountainous load of provisions. What will Lady Emily say? She will be dreadfully unhappy. I could not have believed you and Allen would part company after Mr. Patrington's death. Why not? We were both strangers in the land. He knows how to take care of himself as well as I do. But 2 men, companions and friends, surely they would be safer than one Englishman travelling alone," said Suzette, deeply distressed at the thought of what Allen's mother would suffer when she knew that her son's comrade had left him. "Do you think 2 men are safer from fever, poisoned arrows, the bursting of a gun, the swamping of a canoe? My dearest, Allen is just as safe alone as he was when he was one of 3. He had learnt a good deal about the country, and he knew how to manage the natives, and he had stores and ammunition, and the means of getting plenty more. Don't let me see that sweet face clouded. Ah, my love, I shall never forget your welcoming smile, the light upon your face as you ran to the window. I had always believed in your love, always, even when you were cruelest. But to-night I know that I am the chosen one." He let his head sink on her shoulder and nestled against her like a child at rest near his mother's heart. How could she resist a love so fervent, so resolute, a spirit like Satan's, not to be changed by place or time? It is the lover who will not be denied, the selfish, impetuous, unscrupulous lover, who has always the better chance, and in a case like this it was a foregone conclusion that he who came back first would be the winner. The first strong appeal to the heart that had been tried by absence and anxiety, the first returning wave of romantic love. It was something more than a lover's return. It was the awakening of love from a long sleep that had seemed dull and grey and hopeless as death. "I thought you would never come back," sighed Suzette, resigning herself to the tyranny of the conqueror, content at last to be taken by a coup de main. "I was afraid you and Allen would be left in that dreadful country, and I had to make believe to think you as safe as if you were in the next parish. I had to be cheerful and full of hopefulness for your mother's sake. Your poor mother," starting up suddenly. "Oh, Geoffrey, how cruel that we should be sitting here while she is left in ignorance of your return, and she has suffered an agony of fear since she heard of poor Mr. Patrington's death. It is shameful. You must go to her this instant." "Must I, my queen and mistress?" "This instant. It will be a shock to her, even in the joy of your return, to see how thin and haggard you have grown. What suffering you must have gone through." "Only one kind of suffering, only one malady, Suzette. I was sick for love of you. Love made me do forced marches. Love kept me awake of nights. Impatience was the fever that burnt in my blood. Love and longing for you. Yes, yes, I am going," as she put her hand through his arm and led him to the window. "I will be at my mother's feet in half an hour, kneeling to ask for her blessing on my betrothal." There will be a double joy for her, Suzette, in my home-coming and my happiness. I left her a restless, unquiet spirit. I go back to her tamed and happy." "Yes, yes, only go. Remember that every minute of her life of late has been a minute of anxiety, and she loves you so devotedly, Geoffrey. She has only you to love. I am going, but not till you have told me how soon." "Suzette, how soon what?" "Our marriage. Geoffrey, how absurd of you to talk about that, when I hardly know that we are engaged." "I know it. We are bound and plighted as never lovers were, to my knowledge, since Romeo and Juliet." "How long did Romeo wait, Suzette?" 24 hours, I think. I shall have to wait longer for a special license. Geoffrey, unless you hurry away to the Manor this instant, I will never speak civilly to you again." "Why, what a fury my love can be! What an exquisite termagant! Yes, I will wait for the license. Come to the gate with me, Suzette." They went through the dusky garden to the old-fashioned 5-barred gate, which opened on to a circular drive. The night was cool and grey, and the white bloom of a catalpa tree gleamed ghost-light among the dark masses of the shrubbery. A bat wheeled across the greyness in front of the lovers as they kissed and parted. "Until I can get the license," he repeated, with his happy laugh. "We'll wait for nothing else." "You will have to wait for me," she answered, tossing up her head and running away, a swift white figure vanishing in the bend of the drive as he stood watching her. "Thank God!" he ejaculated. "The reward is worth all that has gone before." Chapter 33. Of Sons of Fire by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. This recording is in the public domain. Am I his keeper? Before the sun had gone down upon the second day after Geoffrey's return, his engagement to Miss Vincent had become known to almost every member of Matcham society who had any right to be posted in the proceedings of the élite. Mrs. Mornington, dropping in at her brother's house after breakfast and before her daily excursion to the village, was transformed into a statue of surprise on the very threshold of the hall at hearing fiddling in her brother's drawing-room, unmistakably fiddling of a superior order, a fiddle whose grandiose chords rose loud and strong above the rippling notes of a piano, a quaint old melody of pourpours in strongly marked common time, a fairy-like accompaniment of delicate treble runs, light as a gauzy veil flung over the severe outlines of a bronze statue. "She must be having accompanying lessons," thought Mrs. Mornington. "Some fiddler from Salisbury, I suppose." She marched into the drawing-room with the privileged unceremoniousness of an aunt, and found Geoffrey Warnock standing beside the piano, at which Suzette was sitting, fresh as a rose, in a pale green frock that looked like the calyx of a living flower. "Home!" cried Mrs. Mornington, with a step backward, and again becoming statuesque. "And I have been picturing you as eaten by tigers or tomahawked by savages." "The African tiger is only a panther, and there are no tomahawks," answered Geoffrey, laying down his bow and going across the room to shake hands with Mrs. Mornington, the Amati still under his chin. "And Allen? Where's Allen?" "I left him on his way to the Congo." "You left him? Came back without him?" "Yes. He wanted to extend his travels, to cross Africa. I was not so ambitious. I only wanted to come home." His smile, as he turned to look at Suzette, told the astute matron all she desired to know. "So," she exclaimed, "is the weathercock nailed to the vane at last?" "The ship, which has been tossing so long upon a sunless sea, is safe in her haven," answered Geoffrey. Mrs. Mornington's keen perceptions took a swift review of the position. A much better match than poor Allen. Discombe, with revenues that had accumulated at compound interest during a long minority, must be better than Beechhurst, a mere villa, and an estate in Suffolk of which Mrs. Mornington knew very little, except that it was hedged in, and its glory overshadowed by the lands of a most noble and a right honourable or two. Discombe, the Squire of Discombe, was a personage in that little world of Matcham, and the world of Matcham was all on the earthward side of the universe for which Mrs. Mornington cared. Suzette's shilly-shallying little ways had answered admirably. It seemed, after all, how wisely Providence orders things if we will only fold our hands and wait. "Don't let me interrupt your musical studies, young people," exclaimed the good lady. "I only came to know if Suzette was going to the golf ground." "Of course I'm going, auntie, if you are walking that way and want company." It was the kind of day on which only hat and gloves are needed for outdoor toilette, and Suzette's neat little hat was ready for her in the hall. They all three went off to the links together, along the dusty road, and through the busy little village, busy just for one morning hour, and to the common beyond, the long stretch of common that skirted the high road, and which everybody declared to have been created on purpose for golf. Mrs. Mornington talked about Allen nearly all the way. Her regret that he had extended his travels, regret felt mostly on his mother's account. "I think he always meant to cross from sea to sea," Geoffrey answered carelessly. "His mother ought to have been prepared for that. He read Treville's book, and that inspired him, and really crossing Africa means very little nowadays. One's people at home needn't worry about it." Mr. Patrington did not find it so easy. "Poor Patrington! No, he was unlucky. There is no reckoning with fever. That is the worst enemy." "Did you bring home a letter for Lady Emily?" "No, Allen wrote from Ujiji. That letter would reach England much quicker than I could." "But you will go to see her, I daresay. No doubt it would be a comfort to her to talk to you about her son, to hear all those details which letters so seldom give." "I will go if she asks me. Suzette has written to tell her of my return." "She will ask you, I'm sure, or she may come to Beechhurst, as she came only a month ago, in the hope of hearing of Allen's movements from your letters to your mother." "I was never so good a correspondent or so good a son as Allen." They were at the golf ground by this time, and here Mrs. Mornington left them, and meeting 5 of her particular friends on the way, told them how a strange thing had happened, and that Geoffrey Warnock, who had left England broken-hearted because Suzette had rejected him, had come back suddenly from Africa and had been accepted. "He took her by storm, poor child, but after all I believe she always preferred him to poor Allen." There seemed nothing wanting now to Mrs. Warnock's happiness. Her son had returned, not to restlessness and impatience, not to weary again of his beautiful home, but to settle down soberly with the wife he adored. His mother was to live with him always. The manor house was still to be her home, the music room her room, the organ hers. In all things she was to be as she had been, plus the son she loved, and the daughter-in-law she would have chosen for herself from all the daughters of earth. "If it were not that I am sorry for Allen, there would not be a cloud in my sky," she told her son on the second night after his return, when he had quieted down a little from that fever of triumphant gladness which had possessed him after his conquest of Suzette. "Dear mother, there is no use in being sorry for Allen. We could not both be winners. To be sorry for him is to grudge me my delight, and I could easily come to believe that you are fonder of Allen than of me." "Geoffrey!" "Well, I'll never say so again, if you'll only leave off lamenting about Allen. He will have all the world before him when he comes back to England. Somewhere, no doubt, there are love and sympathy and beauty and youth waiting for him. When he knows that Suzette has made her choice, he will accept the inevitable and fall in love with somebody else. Not at Matcham." There was the faintest touch of irritation in his reply. That incessant reference to Allen began to jar upon his nerves. Wherever he went he had to answer the same questions, to explain how he wanted to come home, and Allen wanted to go further away, and how for that reason only they had parted. He began to feel like Cain, and to sympathize with that historical character. But the worst was still to come. In the midst of a sonata of de Berrios, long, brilliant, difficult, a tour de force for Suzette, whose fingers had not grappled with such music within the last 2 years, the door of the music room was opened, and Lady Emily Carew was announced, just as upon that grey afternoon a month ago. "Forgive me for descending upon you again in this way," she said hurriedly to Mrs. Warnock, who came from her seat by the window to receive the uninvited guest. "I couldn't rest after I received Miss Vincent's letter." Nothing could have been colder than the Miss Vincent, except the stately recognition of Suzette with which it was accompanied. Mr. Warnock, turning to Geoffrey, without even noticing his mother's outstretched hand, "Why did you leave my son?" "I thought Suzette had told you why we parted. He wished to go on. I wanted to come home. Is there anything extraordinary in that?" Yes, when two men go to an uncivilized country full of dangers and difficulties, and when the third, their guide and leader, has been snatched away, surely it is very strange that they should part. Very cruel of the one whose stronger will insisted upon parting. If you mean to imply that I had no right to come back to England without your son, I can only answer that you are very unjust. If you were a man, Lady Emily, I might be tempted to express my meaning in stronger words. Oh, it is easy enough for you to answer me if you can satisfy your own conscience, if you can answer to yourself for leaving your friend and comrade helpless and alone. Was he more helpless than I? We parted in the centre of Africa. If I chose the easier and shorter route homeward, that route was just as open to him as to me. It was his own choice to go down the Congo River. No doubt his next letter, whenever it may reach you, will tell you all you can want to know as to his reasons for taking that route. When I offered myself as your son's companion, I accepted no apprenticeship. I was tired of Africa. He wasn't. There was no compact between us. I was under no bond to stay with him. He may choose to spend his life there, as Cecil Patrington chose, practically. I wanted to come home. Yes, to be first, to steal my son's sweetheart, said Lady Emily, pale with anger, looking from Geoffrey to Suzette with flashing eyes. Lady Emily, you are unreasonable. I am a mother, and I love my son. Till I see him, till I hear from his own lips that you are not a traitor, that you did not abandon him in danger or distress for your own selfish ends, till then I shall not cease to think of you as I think now. Your mother will, of course, believe whatever you tell her, and Miss Vincent no doubt was easily satisfied. But I am not to be put off so lightly, nor your conscience, as your face tells me. She was gone before any one could answer her. She waited for no courtesy of leave-taking, for no servant to lead the way. Her own resolute hand opened and shut the door before Mrs. Warnock could recover from the shock of her onslaught. Indeed, in those few moments, Mrs. Warnock had only eyes or apprehension for one thing, and that was Geoffrey's white face. Was it anger or remorse that made him so deadly pale? While his mother watched him wonderingly, filled with a growing fear, his sweetheart was too deeply wounded by Lady Emily's scornful speech to be conscious of anything but her own pain. She went back to her place at the piano and bent her head over a page of music, pretending to study an intricate passage, but unable to read a single bar through her thickly gathering tears. End of chapter 33. Chapter 34 of Sons of Fire by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A shadow across the path. No more was seen or heard of Lady Emily at Matcham, except the one fact that she had returned to Suffolk on the morning after her brief appearance at the Manor. Nothing more was known about that poor lonely lady, whom adverse fate had cut adrift from all she loved. At Beechhurst, closed shutters told of the master's absence, and the inquiries of the officious or the friendly elicited only the reply that Mr. Carew was still travelling in Africa, and that no letters had been received from him for a long time. He was in a country where there were no post offices, the housekeeper opined, but she believed her ladyship heard from him occasionally. Geoffrey's return and the news of his engagement to Miss Vincent made a pleasant excitement in the village and neighbourhood. An early marriage was talked about. Mr. Warnock had told the vicar that he was going to be married in a fortnight, had spoken as if he were sole master of the situation. As if such a nice girl as Suzette would allow herself to be hustled into marriage without time for a trousseau, persisted Bessie Edgefield, who assured her friends that there would be no wedding that year. It may be in January, she said, but it won't be before the new year. Geoffrey had pleaded in vain. He had won his sweetheart's promise, but his sweetheart was not to be treated in too masterful a fashion. God knows why we are waiting, or what we are waiting for, he said, in one of those fits of nervous irritability which even Suzette's influence could not prevent. Hasn't my probation been long enough? Haven't I suffered enough? Haven't you kept me on the rack of uncertainty long enough to satisfy your love of power? You are like all women. You think of a lover as a surgeon thinks of a rabbit, too low in the scale for his feelings to be considered, just good enough for vivisection. Can't we be happy, Geoffrey? We have everything in the world that we care for." "I can never be happy till I am sure of you. I am always dreading the moment in which you will tell me you have changed your mind." "I have given you my promise. Isn't that enough?" "No, it is not enough. You gave Alan your promise and broke it." She started up from her seat by the piano and turned upon him indignantly. "If you are capable of saying such things as that, we had better bid each other good bye at once," she said. "I won't submit to be reminded of my wrong-doing by you, who are the sole cause of it. If I had never seen you, I should be Alan's wife this day. You came between us. You tempted me away from him, and now you tell me I am fickle and untrustworthy. I begin to think I have made a worse mistake in promising to be your wife than I made when I engaged myself to Alan." "That means that you are regretting him, that you wish he were here now, in my place." "Not in your place, but I wish he were safe in England. It makes me miserable to be so uncertain of his fate, for his mother's sake." "Well, he will be in England soon enough, I daresay. But you will be my wife by that time, and I shall be secure of my prize. I shall be able to defy 100 Allans." And then he sat down by her side and pleaded for her pardon, almost with tears. He hated himself for those jealous doubts which devoured him, he told her, those fears of he knew not what. If she were but his wife, his own for ever, that stormy soul of his would enter into a haven of peace. The colour of his life would be changed. And even for Alan's sake, he argued, it is better that there should be no delay. He will accept the situation more easily if he find us man and wife. A man always submits to the inevitable. It is uncertainty which kills. He pleaded and was forgiven, and by Suzette was induced to consent to an earlier date for her marriage. It was to be in the second week of December, 5 months after Geoffrey's return, and the honeymoon was to be spent upon that lovely shore where there is no winter. And then early in the year Suzette and her husband were to establish themselves at Discombe, and the doors of the manor house were to be opened as they had never been opened since old Squire Warnock was a young man. Matcham was in good spirits at the prospect of pleasant hospitalities, a going and coming of nice people from London. Nobody in the immediate neighbourhood could afford to entertain upon a scale which would be a matter of course for Geoffrey Warnock. "December will be here before we know where we are," said Mrs. Mornington, and her constitutional delight in action and bustle of all kinds again found a safety valve in the preparation of Suzette's trousseau. Again she was confronted by a chilling indifference in the young lady for whom the clothes were being made. She advised Suzette to spend a week in London in order to get her frocks and jackets from the best people. Salisbury would have been good enough for Alan and Beechhurst, but for Squire Warnock's wife, for the Riviera, and for Discombe Manor, the most fashionable London artists should be called upon for their best achievements. "I suppose you'll want to look well when you show yourself at Cannes as Mrs. Warnock. You won't want to be another awful example of an Englishwoman wearing out her old clothes on the Continent," said Mrs. Mornington, snappishly. As the General was also in favour of a week in town, Suzette consented, and bored herself to death in the family circle of an aunt who was almost a stranger, but who had been offering her hospitality ever since she could remember. At this lady's house in Bryanstone Square she spent a weary week of shopping and trying on, always under the commanding eye of Aunt Mornington, who delighted in tramping about London out of the season, a London in which one could do just what one liked, without fear or favour of society. And so the trousseau was put in hand, the wedding gown chosen, the wedding cake ordered, Mrs. Mornington taking all trouble off her brother's hands in the matter of the reception that was to be held after the wedding. Everybody was to be asked, of course, but the invitations were not to go out till a fortnight before the day. "I don't want people to suppose I'm giving them plenty of time to think about wedding presents," Suzette explained, when she insisted upon this short notice. All these arrangements were made in October. The marriage settlement was drafted, and everybody was satisfied, since Geoffrey's liberality had required the curb rather than the spur. For the rest of the year the lovers had nothing to think of but each other, and those great spirits of the past whose voices still spoke to them, whose genius was the companion of their lives. Beethoven, Mozart, Mendelssohn, Chopin, Schubert, were the friends of those quiet days, and love found its most eloquent interpreters in the language of the dead. Sometimes, with a dim foreboding of evil, Suzette found herself wondering what she would do with that fiery, restless spirit, were it not for that soothing influence of music. But you could not imagine Geoffrey disassociated from that second voice which seemed more characteristic of him than any spoken language, that voice of passionate joys and passionate regrets, of deepest melancholy and of wildest mirth. Music made a third in their lives, the strongest link between them, holding them aloof from that outside world to which the mysteries of harmony were unknown. Matcham society shrugged shoulders of wonder, not unmixed with disdain, when it was told how Miss Vincent practised 6 hours a day at home or at Discombe, and how she was beginning to play as well as a professional. There had been a little dinner at the Manor House, and Geoffrey and his betrothed had played a duet which they called a saltarello, and Mrs. Mornington was complimented on her niece's gifts. Her execution was really surprising. No other young lady in Matcham could play like that. The girls of the present day live too much out of doors to aspire to execution. If they could play some little thing of Schumann's, or the easiest of Chopin's or Rubinstein's valses, they were satisfied with themselves. The hunting season began, but Geoffrey only hunted occasionally. He went only when General Vincent and his daughter went, not otherwise. Suzette had 3 or 4 hunters at her disposal now, and could have ridden to hounds 3 times a week had she so desired. Geoffrey's first care had been to get some of his best horses ready for carrying a lady, and she had her own thoroughbred, clever and kind, and able to carry her for a long day's work. But Suzette was not rabid about riding to hounds in all weathers, and at all distances. She liked a day now and then when her father was inclined to take her, but she had no idea of giving up her whole life, books, music, cottage visiting, home, for fox hunting. Geoffrey gave up many a day's sport in order to spend the wintry hours in the music room at Discombe, or in long rambles in the woods or over the downs with his betrothed. Was he happy, having won his heart's desire? Suzette sometimes found herself asking that question of herself, not of him. He was a creature of moods, sometimes animated, eloquent, hopeful, talking of life as if doubt, sorrow, satiety were unknown to him, undreamt of by him; at other times strangely depressed, silent and gloomy, a dismal companion for a joyous, high-spirited girl. Those moods of his scared Suzette, but she was prepared to put up with them. She had chosen him, or allowed herself to be chosen by him. She had bound herself to life companionship with that fitful, eager spirit. For him she had forsaken a lover whose happier nature need never have caused her an hour's anxiety, a man whose thoughts and feelings were easy to read and understand. She had taken the lover whose caprices and moods had awakened a romantic interest, had aroused first curiosity, then sympathy and regard. It was because he was a genius she loved him, and she must resign herself to the capricious varieties of temperament which make genius difficult to deal with in everyday life. No news of Allen reached Matcham till the beginning of November, when Mrs. Mornington took upon herself to write to Lady Emily about him, and received a very cold reply. "I heard from my son last week," Lady Emily wrote, after a stately acknowledgment of Mrs. Mornington's inquiry. "He has been laid up with fever, but is better, and on his way home." He wrote from Brazzaville. "It is something to know that he did not die in the desert, neglected and alone. Even on the eve of her marriage, your niece may be glad to hear that my son has survived her unkindness and Mr. Warnock's desertion, and that I am hoping to welcome him home before long." Mrs. Mornington showed the letter to Suzette, whose mind was greatly relieved by this news of Allen. "It is such a comfort to know that he is safe," she told Geoffrey, after commenting upon the unkindness of Lady Emily's letter. The news which was so cheering to her had a contrary effect upon her lover. There was a look of trouble in Geoffrey's face when he was told of Allen's expected arrival, and he took no pains to conceal his displeasure. "I'm sorry you have suffered such intense anxiety," he said resentfully. "Did you suspect me of having murdered him?" "Nonsense, Geoffrey. I could not help thinking of all possible dangers, and it distressed me to know that other people thought you unkind in leaving him. Other people have talked like fools, as foolishly as his mother, in whom one forgives folly. I was not his nurse, or his doctor, or his hired servant. I was only a casual companion, and I was free to leave him how and when I pleased." "But not to leave him in distress or difficulty." "I knew you could not have done that. I knew that you could not act ungenerously. I think Lady Emily ought to make you a very humble apology for her rudeness when she has her son safe at home. She may keep her apologies for people who value her opinion. I shall be 1,000 miles away when her son returns." He was silent and gloomy for the rest of the morning, and Suzette felt that she had offended him. Was he so jealous of her former lover that even the mention of his name, a natural interest in his safety, could awaken angry feelings and make a distance between them? Even their music went badly, and Mrs. Warnock, from her seat by the fire, reproached them for careless playing. "That sonata of Popora's went ever so much better last week," she said, on which Geoffrey threw down his bow in disgust. "I dare say you are right. I am not in the cue for music. Will you come for a ride directly after lunch, Suzette? I can drive you home, and the horses can follow while you are getting on your habit. We might fall in with the hounds." Suzette declined this handsome offer. She was not going to stay to lunch. "Father complains that I am never at home," she said, putting away the music. "Your father is out with the hounds. What is the use of your going back to an empty house?" "I would rather be at home to day, Geoffrey, to think about Alan, and offer a thanksgiving for his safety. I am full of thankfulness, and I am not ashamed of being glad." She went over to Mrs. Warnock, who had been too much absorbed in her book to be aware that the lovers were quarrelling, till Suzette's brief good bye and rapid departure startled her out of her tranquillity. "Aren't you going to walk home with her, Geoffrey?" she asked, when her son returned to the music room, after escorting his sweetheart no further than the hall door. "No," he answered curtly. "We have had enough of each other for to day." He went to the library, where the morning papers were lying unread, and turned to the second page of the Times for the list of steamers, and then to the shipping intelligence. Zanzibar? Yes, there was a steamer reported from Zanzibar. She had passed the Needles yesterday afternoon. Alan was in England, perhaps. If all went well with him, he would come by the first ship after the mail that brought his letter. He was in England, he whom Geoffrey had cruelly, treacherously deserted, helpless and alone. "All is fair in love," Geoffrey told himself, "but I wonder what Suzette will think of her future husband when she knows all. Her future husband. If I were but her actual husband, I could defy fate. Who knows? Something may have happened to hinder his return. A fit of fever, a difficulty on the road. 3 more weeks, and he may come back safe and sound. It won't matter to me. I have no murderous thoughts about him. He may tell her the worst he can about me. Once my wife, I can hold and keep her in spite of the world. I will teach her that the man who sins for love's sake must be forgiven for the sake of his love." He was consumed with a fever of anxiety which would not let him rest within 4 walls. He walked to Beechhurst and unearthed a caretaker who came strolling from the distant stables, where he had been enlivening his idleness by gossip with the grooms. The blinds and shutters were all closed. Nothing had been heard from Mr. Carew. "If he were in England, you would have heard from him, I suppose?" said Geoffrey. "Yes, sir. He would have wired, no doubt. My wife is housekeeper, and she would have had notice to get the house ready." "Even if Mr. Carew had gone to Suffolk in the first instance?" "I should think so, sir. He would know we should want time to prepare for him." There was relief in this. No news. Perhaps the ship had passed the Needles yesterday, had carried no such passenger as the man whose return Geoffrey Warnock dreaded. He went back to the Manor in the gloom of a November twilight. The deepening dusk and the loneliness of the road suited his humour. He wanted to be alone, to think out the situation, to walk down the devil within him. Matcham church clock was chiming the 3rd quarter after 4 when he opened the gate and went into Discombe Wood. But when the Discombe dressing bell rang, an old-fashioned bell in a cupola, which gave needless information to every cottager within half a mile of the manor house, Geoffrey had not come in. His valet waited about for him till nearly dinner time, and then went down to the drawing-room to ask Mrs. Warnock if his master was to dine at home. "He is not in his dressing-room, ma'am." "Will you wait dinner for him?" "Yes, yes, of course I shall wait. Tell them to keep the dinner back." The dinner was kept back so long that nobody eat any of it. Out of the servants' hall, Mrs. Warnock spent a troubled evening in the music-room, full of harassing fears, while grooms rode here and there to Marsh House to inquire if Mr. Warnock was dining there, to Matcham Road Station to ask if he had left by any train up or down the line, to the vicarage, a most unlikely place, and to other houses where it was just possible, but most improbable, that he should allow himself to be detained. But nowhere within the narrow circle of Matcham life was Mr. Warnock to be heard of. "Pray don't be anxious about Geoffrey," Suzette wrote, in answer to Mrs. Warnock's hastily scribbled note of inquiry. "You know how erratic he is. He was vexed at something I said about Alan this morning, and he has gone off somewhere in a huff. Keep up your spirits, chère mère. I will be with you early to morrow morning. I am not frightened." "She is not frightened. If she loved him as I do, she would be as anxious as I am," commented Mrs. Warnock, when she had read Suzette's letter. CHAPTER 35 of Sons of Fire by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. It is the stars. Morning brought no relief of mind to Mrs. Warnock, since it brought no news of her son. But before night there was even greater anxiety at Beechhurst, where Alan Carew's mother arrived late in the evening, summoned by a letter from her son, dispatched from Southampton on the previous day, announcing his arrival and asking her to join him at Beechhurst. "I would go straight to Suffolk," he wrote, "knowing how anxious my dear, tender-hearted mother will be to welcome her wanderer home, only I think you know that there is some one at Matcham, about whose feelings I have still a shadow of doubt, still a lingering hope. I go there first, where perhaps I may meet you, and if I find that faint hope to be only a delusion, I know you will sympathize with my final disappointment. I have passed through many adventures and some dangers since I left the great lake. I've been ill, and I've been lonely, but I come back to England the same man who went away, unchanged in heart and mind. However altered you may find the outer man, the inner man is the same." Having telegraphed from Waterloo to announce her arrival at Matcham Road Station, Lady Emily was bitterly disappointed at not finding her son waiting for her on the platform. She looked eagerly out into the November darkness, searching for the well-known figure among the few people standing here and there along the narrow platform. There was no Alan, and there was no Beechhurst carriage waiting for her. The station-master recognized her as she alighted, and came to assist in the selection of her luggage, while a porter ran off to order a fly from the inn outside. "Mr. Carew was expected home yesterday. Did he come?" asked Lady Emily, with that faint sickness of blank despair which follows on such a disappointment. She had pictured the moment of reunion over and over again during the journey, had fancied how he would look, what he would say to her, and the delight of their long, confidential talk on the drive home, and the pleasure of their tete-a-tete dinner. The only shadow upon her happy thought of him was her knowledge of what his faithful heart must needs suffer when he found that Suzette had engaged herself to his rival. The station-master informed Lady Emily that Mr. Carew had arrived the day before by this very train. He had evidently sent no notice of his arrival, as there was no carriage to meet him. He had very little luggage with him, only a portmanteau and a bale of rugs and sticks, which had been sent to Beechhurst by the station bus. Mr. Carew had walked home. He was at home, then. The gladness of reunion was only delayed for an hour. His mother tried to make light of her disappointment and of his neglect. He had given an order to the stable, perhaps, and it had been forgotten. There was a mistake somewhere, but no unkindness on his part. "Was my son looking in pretty good health?" she asked the station-master. "Yes, my lady. Allowing for the wear and tear of a sea voyage, Mr. Carew looked pretty well, but he looked pulled down a bit since he went away. You mustn't be surprised at a little change in that way." "Yes, yes, no doubt he is altered. Years of travel and fatigue and danger. Ah, there is the fly. They have been very quick. Come, Taylor," to the middle-aged, homely Suffolk Abigail, who stood on guard over her mistress's luggage. The drive through the November night seemed longer to the lady inside the carriage, sitting alone and longing for the sight of her son's face, than to her maid on the box beside John Coachman of the station inn, chatting sociably about the improvements in the neighbourhood and the prospects of the hunting season. And oh, bitter agony of disappointment when the door of Beechhurst was open, and Lady Emily saw only a half-lit hall and staircase, and the stolid countenance of butler and caretaker, whose informal attire too plainly showed her that his master was not in the house. "Has Mr. Carew gone away again?" she asked, as the man helped her out of the carriage, thinking vaguely that Alan might have started off for Suffolk that morning, and that she and he were travelling to and fro at cross purposes. "Mr. Carew has not been home, my lady." "Not been home? Why, he arrived yesterday by the train I came by to-night. The station master told me so." "Then he must be visiting somewhere in the neighbourhood, my lady. Some luggage was brought at 9 o'clock, but my master has not been home." She stood looking at the man dumbly, paralyzed by apprehension. Where could Alan be? What could he have done with himself? His letter had asked her to meet him in that house. He had arrived at the station 24 hours before he could expect her. He had sent home his luggage, and had walked out of the station in the most casual manner, saying that he was going home. Was it credible that he would go to anybody else's house, straight from the station, luggageless, newly landed after a long sea voyage? No man in his senses would so act. Yet there was but one course for an anxious mother to take, and Lady Emily returned to the fly, and ordered the man to drive to Marsh House. Alan might have gone straight to Suzette. Who could tell what effect the news of her approaching marriage might have upon his mind? His letter told his mother that he still hoped, and the change from hope to despair would be crushing. He might have hurried away from the scene of his disappointment, careless how or where he went, so long as he got himself far away from the place associated with his fickle sweetheart. Suzette was at home, and received Lady Emily kindly, forgetting all that had gone before in her compassion for the mother's distress. Alan had called at Marsh House on the previous evening during Suzette's absence. He had been told that she was at the Manor, and the servant had understood him to say that he was going on to the Manor. He had seemed put out at hearing where she was, the soldier servant had told his young mistress. "And were you not at the Manor when he called?" Lady Emily asked. "No, I left before lunch, but instead of coming home, where I was not expected, I spent the afternoon at the vicarage and on the golf ground with Bessie Edgefield." "And Mr. Warnock was with you most of the time, I suppose?" "Not any of the time." "Is he away, then?" "No. If you must know the truth, we had, well, I can hardly say we had quarrelled, but Geoffrey had been very disagreeable, and I was glad to leave him to himself for the afternoon." "You are good friends again now, no doubt?" "We have not seen each other since. Geoffrey has gone away without letting any one know where he was going, and his poor mother is anxious and unhappy about him. He is so impetuous, so erratic. And you, his sweetheart, are still more anxious, no doubt?" "I am anxious chiefly for his poor mother's sake. She is too easily frightened." "Can they have gone away together anywhere?" said Lady Emily. "Together? Alan and Geoffrey?" exclaimed Suzette. "No, I don't think they would do that." "Why not? They were together for 2 years in Africa." "Yes, but that was different. I don't think, in Geoffrey's temper, that he would have gone on a journey with your son. He has a jealous temper, I am sorry to say, and he was irritable and unreasonable yesterday when he heard of Mr. Carew's return. Is it likely that he would have gone off on any expedition with him, to London or anywhere else?" "Then where is my son? He was here at this hour yesterday. He left here to go to the Manor, and now you tell me that Mr. Warnock is missing, and that my son has not been heard of since he left your door." "He has not been at the Manor. Mrs. Warnock would have told me if he had called. I was with her all this morning. She is wretched about Geoffrey. They are both safe, I daresay, but their disappearance is very alarming." "Alarming, yes. It means something dreadful, something I dare not think of, unless indeed Alan changed his mind on finding the state of things here, and went off to Suffolk, intending to anticipate my journey. Oh, I daresay I am frightening myself for nothing. Will you let me write a telegram?" looking distractedly round the room for pens and ink. "Dear Lady Emily, pray don't be too anxious. One is so often frightened for nothing. My father is only to be an hour later than usual on a hunting day, in order to make me half distracted. Please sit down by the fire, here in this comfortable chair. I'll write your telegram and send it off instantly." She rang the bell, and then seated herself quietly at her writing-table, while Alan's mother sank into a chair, the image of helplessness. "What shall I say?" "To Alan Carew, Bendyke, Millfield, Suffolk. I am miserable at not finding you here. Reply immediately with full information as to your plans. Emily Carew." "God grant I may hear of him there," said Lady Emily, when she had read message and address with a searching eye, lest Suzette's writing should offer any excuse for mistakes. The telegram was handed to the servant, with instructions to take it himself to the post office, and then Lady Emily kissed Suzette with a sad, remorseful kiss, and went back to the fly. "Discombe Manor," she told the man, with very little consideration for the hard-working fly horse. "Yes, my lady, it'll be about as much as he can do." "He? What do you mean?" "The horse, my lady. He's been on his legs 2 hours already, and the Manor's a good 3 mile, but I suppose I shall be able to wash out his mouth there before I takes him home." "Yes, yes, you may do what you like, only get me to the Manor as fast as you can." Alan had not been seen at the Manor. No one had rung the hall door-bell yesterday after luncheon. Mrs. Warnock's monastic solitude was not often intruded upon by visitors, and yesterday there had been no one. The door had not been opened after Miss Vincent went out, Geoffrey Warnock's impatient temper always choosing an easier mode of egress than that ponderous hall door, which required a servant's attendance, or else closed with a bang that reverberated through the house. Whatever Alan's intention might have been when he left Marsh House, he had not come to Discombe. Lady Emily and Mrs. Warnock were softened in their feelings for each other by a mutual terror, but Alan's mother dwelt upon the fact that the two young men, as fellow travellers of old, might have started off upon some expedition. A run up to London to see some new production at the theatre, a billiard match, anything in which young men might be interested. They must be much better friends than before they went to Africa, much closer companions, urged Lady Emily. "I feel there is less reason for fear now that I know your son is missing as well as Alan." Mrs. Warnock tried to take the same hopeful view, but she was of a less hopeful temperament, and she knew too much of Geoffrey's jealous distrust of his rival to believe that there had been any companionable feeling between the two young men since Alan's return. "Oh, I am afraid, I am afraid," she moaned piteously, wringing her hands in an agony of apprehension. "What is it you fear? What calamity can have happened which would involve both your son and mine? Surely nothing dreadful could happen to both our sons, and yet no tidings come either to you or to me. Wherever they were, if any accident happened, one or other of them would be recognized. Someone would bring us the news. No, I have been anxious and unhappy, but I am sure now that I have been needlessly anxious. We shall hear from them very soon." Mrs. Warnock clasped Lady Emily's hand in silence, and shook her head despondently. "What is it you fear?" asked Alan's mother. "I don't know, but I am full of fear for Geoffrey. for both of them. Lady Emily left her, depressed and dispirited by the fear which shrunk from shaping itself in words. The disposition to take a hopeful view of the case did not last in the face of Mrs. Warnock's mysterious agitations, and Alan's mother went back to Beechhurst, stupefied with anxiety, able only to walk about the house in and out of the empty rooms in helpless misery. That state of not knowing what to fear ended suddenly, soon after 9 o'clock, when there came the sound of wheels, and a carriage stopped at the hall door. Lady Emily rushed to the door and opened it with her own hands. Before anyone had time to ring the bell, opened it to find herself face to face with the woman she had left only 2 hours before. Mrs. Warnock was stepping out of her carriage as the hall door opened. She wore neither bonnet nor cloak, only a shawl wrapped round her head and shoulders. "He is found," she said agitatedly. "Will you come with me?" "Your son?" "No, Alan Carew." "Ah, it is dreadful to think of, dreadful to tell you. I came myself. I wouldn't let anyone else." "He is dead," cried Lady Emily, her heart feeling like ice, her knees trembling under her. "No, no, dreadfully hurt, but not dead. There is hope still. Mr. Podmore does not give up hope. I have sent a messenger to Salisbury. We shall have Dr. Etheridge to-morrow morning, or I will send to London. Where is my son? My murdered, dying son? No, 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 not dying, not murdered. Don't I tell you there is hope? He is at Discombe. They have put him in Geoffrey's room. Everything is being done. He may recover. He will. He must recover." Lady Emily was seated in the room, unconscious of the movements that had conveyed her there. The butler was at the hall door by this time, staring in blank wonder, not knowing what to think of this rapid departure. "Send your mistress's maid to the Manor with her things," ordered Mrs. Warnock hurriedly, and then to her own servant waiting at the carriage door. "Home as fast as you can drive." "Why was he taken to your house and not to his own?" asked Lady Emily in a dull whisper, when the carriage had driven out of the gates. "Because it was so much nearer to bring him. He was found in our woods, robbed and hurt, cruelly hurt. There is a dreadful wound upon his head, and there are signs of a desperate struggle, as if he had fought for his life. Oh, God, that he should be murdered here in England within an hour's walk of his own house! And I have dreamt of him in some dreadful danger, from savage beasts, savage men, night after night, in those dreary years he was away, and that he should come home, home, to love and happiness and safety, as I thought, to meet the fate I had been fearing. I prayed God day and night for him, prayed that he might be brought back to me in safety, and he came back only to die," wailed the unhappy woman, her head sunk upon her knees, her hands working convulsively amongst her loosened hair. "He will not die," cried Mrs. Warnock fiercely. "Don't I tell you that he will not die? The wound need not be fatal. The doctor said it was not a hopeless case. Why do you go on raving as if you wanted him to die, as if you were bent on being miserable, and driving me mad? You? What have you to do with it? He is not your son. Your son is safe enough, I dare say. Your son who left him in the desert, who came sneaking home to steal his comrade's sweetheart. Your son is safe. Selfish wretches of that kind are never in danger." Mrs. Warnock bore this insulting speech in silence, and there was no word more on either side for the rest of the journey. Not without hope, looking down at the motionless form lying on Geoffrey Warnock's bed in the large, airy room, the hand on the coverlet, as white as the lawn sheet, the face disfigured and hardly to be recognized as Alan's face under the broad linen bandage which covered forehead and eyes, the lips livid and speechless. Looking with agonized heart at this spectacle, Alan's mother found it hard to believe the doctor's assurance that the case was not, in his humble opinion, utterly hopeless. "We shall know more to-morrow," he said. "Are they trying to find the wretch who did it?" asked Lady Emily. "God grant he may be hanged for murder, if my son is to die. I shall go from here to the police station, and take all necessary steps if I have your ladyship's authority for doing so. The keeper who found your poor son sent a lad off to give information." "Yes, yes. And you will offer a reward, a large reward. My poor boy, my dear, dear son, to see him lying there quite unconscious, speechless, helpless. My murdered boy. Where did they find him? How?" "Lying in a little hollow among the underwood within a few paces of the path. There is a gate in the fence opening into the high road, and a footpath and cart track which cut into the main drive 400 or 500 yards from the gate. It is a point at which he might be likely to meet a tramp, as it is so near the road, and a long way from any of the lodge gates. The drive would be in Mr. Carew's straight course from Marsh House here." "Yes, yes. And it was a tramp, you are sure of that, a common robber who attacked him. Evidently his pockets were turned inside out, his watch was gone. There was a day when no one man would have dared to attack my son." "There may have been two men. The ground was a good deal trampled, the keeper told me, but they would be able to see very little by the light of a couple of lanterns brought from the stables to the north lodge. We shall see the footsteps and be able to come to a better idea of the struggle to morrow morning." "Send for a London detective, the best that can be got," Lady Emily interrupted eagerly. "Be sure we will do all that can be done. He has no father to take his part," she went on distractedly, "no wife, no sweetheart even, to care for him, only a poor weak mother. If he should die, there will be only one broken heart in the world, only one." "Dear lady, why anticipate the worst?" remonstrated the doctor. "Yes, yes, I am wrong. I must cast myself upon God's mercy. I am not an irreligious woman. I will pray for him, pray. There is nothing else in the world that I can do. But while I am praying, you will work, you will find the wretch who did this cruel deed. You will send for the cleverest doctor in London, the one man of all men who can cure my poor boy." "You may trust me, Lady Emily. Nothing shall be forgotten or deferred." It was not till the following morning that the news of Alan Carew's condition and his presence at Discombe reached General Vincent and his daughter. Mrs. Mornington was the bearer of those dismal tidings. Always active, alert, and early afoot, she heard of the tragedy from the village tradesmen, and was told three conflicting versions of the story. First, at the grocer's, where she was assured that Mr. Carew had breathed his last 5 minutes after he was carried into the manor house. Next, from the butcher's wife, a very ladylike person, rarely seen except through glass in a little counting house giving on to the shop, and who opened her glass shutter on purpose to inform Mrs. Mornington that both young gentlemen had been picked up for dead in the copse at Discombe. Mr. Warnock shot through the heart, Mr. Carew with a bullet in his left temple, the result of a duel to the death. A third informant, taking the air in front of the coach-builder's workshop, where everybody's carriages went sooner or later for repairs, assured Mrs. Mornington that there hadn't been much harm done, and that Mr. Carew, who'd had his pockets picked by a tramp, had been more frightened than hurt. Mrs. Mornington was not the kind of person to languish in uncertainty about any fact in local history while she possessed the nerves of speech and locomotion. Before the coach-builder finished his rambling story, she had dispatched a village boy to the grove to order her pony cart to be brought her as quickly as the groom could get it ready, and her orders being always respected, the honest bay cob met her, rattling his bit and whisking his tail from joyous freshness, at the bend of the village street within a quarter of an hour of the messenger's start. The boy had run his fastest. The groom had not lost a moment, for Mrs. Mornington was one of those excellent mistresses who stand no nonsense from their servants. The cob went to Discombe at a fast trot, and returned stablewards still faster, indulging in occasional spurts of cantering, which his mistress did not check with her usual severity. She saw no one but servants at the manor house. Mrs. Warnock was in her own room, quite prostrate. The butler explained. Lady Emily was with Mr. Carew, who had passed a bad night, and was certainly no better this morning, even if he were no worse. "Is it very serious, David?" Mrs. Mornington asked the trustworthy old servant. "I'm afraid it couldn't be much worse, ma'am. The doctor from Salisbury was here at 9 o'clock, and was upstairs with Mr. Podmore very near an hour, but he didn't look very cheerful when he left. No more did Mr. Podmore. And there's another doctor been telegraphed for from London. If doctors can save the poor gentleman's life, he'll be spared. But I saw his face last night when he was carried upstairs, and I can't say I've much hopes of him." "Never mind your hopes, David. If the doctors can pull him through, A young man can get over a good deal. If he can get over having his head mashed and lying for 27 hours in a wood, he must have a better constitution than ever I heard tell of. The wretch who attacked him has not been found yet, I suppose?" "No, ma'am, not yet, nor never likely to be, so far as I can see. He had 27 hours start, you see, ma'am, and if a professional thief couldn't get off with that much law, the profession can't be up to much." "Begging your pardon, ma'am, for venturing to express an opinion," concluded David, who felt that he had been presuming on an old servant's license. Mrs. Mornington told him she was very glad to hear his opinion, and then handed him cards for the two ladies, on each of which she had scribbled assurances of sympathy, and with this much information from the fountain head, she appeared in the drawing-room at Marsh House, where she found Suzette sitting by the fire in a very despondent mood. Her lover's mysterious disappearance, after something which was very like a quarrel, was not a cheering incident in her life, and now Lady Emily's anxiety about her son, the fact that he, too, should be missing, increased her trouble of mind. She listened aghast to her aunt's story. "What does it mean?" she faltered. "What can it mean?" "The meaning is plain enough, I think. This poor young man was waylaid in the dusk on Thursday evening, attacked and plundered." "By a tramp? By one of the criminal classes? A ticket of leave man, perhaps, rambling from Portland to London, ready to snatch any opportunity on the way? There's very little use in speculating about a wretch of that class. There are plenty of such ruffians loose in the world, I dare say. But it would have served a robber's purpose just as well to have only stunned him." "Oh, those gentry don't consider things so nicely. No doubt Allen showed fight, and the ruffian would have no mercy." "Do you think he will die? Oh, aunt, how terrible if he were to die! And Geoffrey still away. Mrs. Warnock miserable about him." "Yes, that's the strangest part of the business. What can have induced Geoffrey to take himself off in that mysterious way? Have you any idea why he went?" "No, I have no idea. If he is keeping away of his own accord, if nothing dreadful has happened to him, his conduct is most insulting to you." "Never mind me, aunt, while there is this trouble at Discombe. For poor Lady Emily, I am very sorry for her, but I am obliged to think of you. His behaviour places you in such an awkward position, a ridiculous position. Your wedding date fixed, hurried on with red-hot impatience by this young man, and he the bridegroom missing. What do you suppose people will say?" "I have no suppositions about people outside our lives. I can only think of the sorrow at Discombe. People can say anything they like," Suzette answered wearily. Her father had been questioning her, and had talked very much in the same strain as her aunt. She was tired to heart-sickness to talk about Geoffrey. All had grown dark in her life, and darkest of all was her thought of her betrothed. There had been that in his manner when she parted with him which had filled her with a shapeless dread, a terror not to be lightly named, a terror she had not ventured to suggest even to her father. And here was her aunt teasing her about other people, utterly indifferent people, and their ideas. "What will people not say?" exclaimed Mrs. Mornington, after a troubled pause, in which she had poked the fire almost savagely, and pulled a chair back straight. "I must have a serious talk with your father. Is he at home?" "No, he is out shooting." "Shooting? It is scarcely decent of him in the present state of affairs. Any more presents?" "I don't know. Yes, there was a box came this morning. I haven't opened it. Please don't talk of presents. It is too horrid to think of them." "Horridly embarrassing," said Mrs. Mornington. "You had better come to the Grove, Suzette. There is no good in your moping alone here, and you may have visitors in the afternoon, prying and questioning." "Thanks, aunt. I would rather be at home. I shall deny myself to everybody except Bessie Edgefield." "Ah, and you'll tell her everything, and she will tell everybody in Matcham?" "I have nothing to tell. Nothing that Bessie cannot find out from other people. But she is not a gossip, and she is always simpatica." Chapter 35. Chapter 36 of Sons of Fire by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Madness or crime? Days grew into weeks, and the slow, anxious hours brought very little change in Allen's condition, and certainly no change which the doctors could call a substantial improvement. Physician and surgeon from London, famous specialists both, came at weekly intervals and testified to the good fight which the patient was making, and the latent power of a frame which had been strained and wasted by the hardships of African travel, and which was now called upon to recover from severe injuries. Consciousness had returned, but not reason. The young man had not once recognized the mother who rarely left his bedside, but whose bland and pleasant countenance was so sorely altered by grief and anxiety that even in the full possession of his senses he might hardly have known her. The power of speech had returned, but only in delirious utterances, or in a strange gibberish, which poor Lady Emily mistook for an African language, but which was really the nonsense tongue of a disordered brain. The doctors pronounced the case was not utterly without hope, but they would commit themselves to nothing further than this. It was a wonder to have kept him alive so long. His recovery would be almost a miracle. 2 trained nurses from the county hospital alternated the daily and nightly watch by the sick bed, and Lady Emily shared the days, and sometimes the nights, duty, humbly assisting the skilled attendants, grateful for being permitted to aid in the smallest service for the son who lay helpless, inert, and unobserving on that bed, which even yet might be his bed of death. No one but those 3 women and the doctors was allowed to enter Alan's room. Mrs. Warnock was very kind and sympathetic in spite of torturing anxieties about her son's unexplained absence, but she expressed no desire to see Alan, and she seldom saw Lady Emily for more than a few minutes in the course of the day. The whole house was ordered with reference to the sick room. Organ and piano were closed and dumb, and a funereal silence reigned everywhere. And so the wintry days went by, and rain and rough weather made a sufficient excuse for Suzette staying quietly at home and seeing very little of the outer world. Mrs. Mornington took the social aspect of the crisis entirely on her own hands, and informed her friends that the wedding had been deferred, partly on account of Alan's illness, and for other reasons which she was not at liberty to explain. "My niece is very capricious," she said. "I hope she has not sent Mr. Warnock off to Africa again," exclaimed Mrs. Roebuck. "Such a brilliant young man, with a house so peculiarly adapted for entertaining, should not be allowed to become an absentee. It is too great a loss for such a place as this, where so few people entertain." Mrs. Roebuck's estimate of her acquaintance was always based upon their capacity for entertaining, though she herself on this scale would have been marked 0. "No, I don't think he will go back to Africa, but my niece and he have agreed to part, for a short time at any rate. She is sending back all her wedding presents this week. Oh, pray don't let her send me that absurd Japanese paper knife. I only chose it because it is so deliciously ugly and queer, and I knew that marrying a man of Mr. Warnock's means, she wouldn't want anything costly or useful, no fish knives or salt cellars." "Well, if it really is off, or likely to be off," Mr. Roebuck said with a solemnly confidential air, "I don't mind saying in confidence that I think your niece has acted wisely. The young man is a genius, no doubt, but he's a little bit overstrung, fanatico per la musica, don't you know, and one never knows whether that sort of thing won't go further," tapping his forehead suggestively. "Oh, das macht nicht. The poor dear young man is Tokay, only Tokay, not valet," protested Mrs. Roebuck, who affected a polyglot style. "Ah, but the mother, don't you know, that's where the danger comes in. The mother has never been quite right," argued her husband. "I'm not going to accept congratulations," said Mrs. Mornington. "I'm very sorry the marriage has been postponed. Mr. Warnock and Suzette are admirably adapted for each other, and he is no more cracked than I am. And remember, the marriage is put off, not broken off." "All the more reason why she should not send me back that Japanese absurdity," said Mrs. Roebuck, as if the paper knife were of as much consequence as the marriage. Suzette saw Mrs. Warnock nearly every day during that time of trouble, sometimes at Discombe, where they sat together in the music room, or paced the wintry garden, saying very little to each other, but the elder woman taking comfort from the presence of the younger. "I am miserable about him," she told Suzette, and that was all she would ever say of her son. She had no suggestions to offer as to the cause of his disappearance. She uttered no complaint of his unkindness. Suzette inquired if the police had made any discovery about Alan's assailant. No, nothing, or at least Mrs. Warnock had heard of nothing. "Lady Emily may know more than she cares to tell me," she said. "Oh, I think not. Living in your house, indebted so deeply to your kindness, she could not be so churlish as to keep anything back. She thinks of nothing but her son. She would have no mercy upon any one who had injured him." Her tone startled Suzette with the recurrence of a terror which she had tried to dismiss from her mind as groundless and irrational. No, no, of course not. Who could expect her to have mercy? However hard the law might be, she would never think the sentence hard enough. Her only son, her idolized son, brought to the brink of the grave, perhaps doomed to die in spite of all that can be done for him. Suzette tried to shut out that horrible idea, the hideous fancy that the ruffian who had attacked Alan Carew was no casual offender, extemporizing a crime on the suggestion of the moment for the chance contents of a gentleman's purse and an obvious watch and chain. Murder so brutal is not often the result of a chance encounter. Yet such things have been, and the alternative of a private vengeance, a vindictive jealousy, culminating in attempted murder, was too horrible. Yet that dreadful suspicion haunted Suzette's pillow in the long winter nights, nights of wakefulness and sorrow. Where was he, that miserable man who had won her heart in spite of her better reason, and in loving whom she had seldom been without the sense of trouble and fear? His want of mental balance had been painfully obvious to her even in their happiest hours, and she had felt that there was peril in a nature so capricious and so intense. She had discovered that for him religion was no strong rock. He had laughed away every serious question, and had made her feel that in all the most solemn thoughts of life and afterlife they were divided by an impassable gulf. On his side all that is boldest and saddest in modern thought; on her side the simple, unquestioning faith which she had accepted in the dawn of her reason, and which satisfied an intellect not given to speculate upon the unknowable. She had found that not only upon religious questions, but even on the moral code of this life, there were wide differences in their ideas. Dimly and with growing apprehension she had divined the element of lawlessness in Geoffrey's character, revealed in his admiration of men for whom neither religion nor law had been a restraining influence, men for whom passion had been ever the guiding star. Lives that to her seemed only criminal were extolled by him as sublime. Such, or such a man whose unbridled will had wrought ruin for himself and others, was lauded as one who had known the glory of life in its fullest meaning, who had verily lived, not crawled between earth and heaven. In her own simple, unpretentious way, Suzette had tried to combat opinions which had shocked her, and then Geoffrey had laughed off her fears, and had promised that for her sake he would think as she thought, he would school himself to accept a spiritual guide of her choosing. "Who shall my master be, Suzette? Shall I be broad and liberal with Stanley, severe with Manning, intense with Liddon, mystical with Newman? Thou for my sake at Allah's shrine, and I, you know the rest. I will do anything to make my dearest happy." "Anything except pretend, Geoffrey. You must never do that." "Mustn't I? Then we'd better leave religion out of the question, until perhaps it may grow up in my mind suddenly, like Jonah's gourd, out of my love for you." In all the weary time, while Alan was lying at the gate of death and Geoffrey had so strangely vanished, Suzette had never doubted the love of her betrothed. The possibility of change or fickleness on his part never entered into her mind. Of the truth and intensity of his affection she, who had been his betrothed for nearly half a year, could not doubt. Her fears and anxieties took a darker form than any fear of alienated feelings or inconstancy. Suicide, crime, madness were the things she feared, though she never expressed her fears. Her father heard no lamentations from those pale lips, but he could read the marks of distress in her countenance, and he was grieved and anxious for her sake. He, too, invoked the powers of the detective police, but quietly, and without anybody's knowledge. He went up to London and put the case of Geoffrey's disappearance before one of the sagest philosophers who had ever adorned the detective force at Scotland Yard, now retired and practising delicate investigations on his own account. "Do you suppose there has been a fatal accident, or that he has been keeping out of the way on purpose?" he asked, after all particulars had been stated. "An accident would have been heard of before now. No doubt he is keeping out of the way. Have you any reason to suppose him mentally afflicted?" "Afflicted? No. Eccentric, perhaps, though I should hardly call him that. Capricious, somewhat whimsical. Mentally afflicted? No, decidedly not." "Ah, that trick of keeping out of the way is a very common thing in madness. If he is not mad, there must be some strong reason for his disappearance. He must have done something to put himself in jeopardy." "Impossible. No, no, no. I can't entertain the idea for a moment," cried the General, thinking of that murderous attack in the wood. "Do you wish us to make inquiries?" "No, no, better not. The young man's mother is having everything done. I'm not a relation. I only wanted the benefit of a professional opinion. I thought you might be able to throw some light." "No two cases are quite alike, sir, but I think you will find I am right here, and that in this case there is lunacy, or there has been a crime." "Madness or crime," mused the General, as he left the office. "I can't go back to Suzette and tell her that. I must take her away again." He announced his intention of starting for the Riviera next morning at the breakfast table, but his daughter implored him piteously to let her stay at Matcham. "It would be so heartless to go away while Alan is hovering between life and death, and while—" She left the sentence unfinished. She could not trust herself to speak of Geoffrey. Chapter 36. Chapter 37 of Sons of Fire by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. This recording is in the public domain. He hath awakened from the dream of life. It was the day which was to have seen Suzette's wedding, the 13th of December, a dull, mild December, promising that green Christmas which is said to people churchyards with newcomers, a December to gladden the heart of the fox hunter and disappoint the skater. Sitting in melancholy solitude by the drawing-room fire on this grey, rainy morning, Suzette was glad to remember that she had prevented the sending out of invitation cards, and that very few people in Matcham knew the intended date of that wedding which was never to be. There were not many to think of her with especial pity on this particular day, sitting alone in her desolation, in her dark serge frock, with the black poodle Caro and her piano for her only companions. Even the companionship of that beloved piano had failed her since Geoffrey's disappearance. Music was too closely associated with his presence. There was not a single composition in her portfolio that did not recall him, not an air she played that did not bring back the words he had spoken when last her fingers followed the caprices of the composer. He had been her master as well as her lover. He had taught her the subtleties of musical expression, had breathed mind into her music. Bessie Edgefield knew the date, but Bessie was sympathetic and never officious or obtrusive. She would drop in by and by, no doubt, pretending not to remember anything particular about the day. She would be full of some little bit of village news, or a new book from Mudie's, or Mrs. Roebuck's last bonnet. The wedding was to have been at 2:00, a sensible, comfortable hour, giving the bride ample leisure in which to put on her wedding finery. The hours between breakfast and luncheon seemed longer than usual that morning, a long blank weariness after Suzette had seen her father mount and ride away on his favourite hunter. The hounds met on the other side of the downs, on the borders of Hampshire. It would be late, most likely, before she would welcome that kind father to the comfortable fireside, and listen, or at least pretend to listen, to the varying fortunes of an adventurous day. And in the meantime she had the day all before her, to dispose of as best she might, that day which was to have seen her a bride. Was she sorrowing for the lover who had forsaken her, as she sat looking with sad, tearless eyes into the fire? Was she regretting the happiness that might have been, thinking of a life which should have been cloudless? No, she had never contemplated a life of cloudless happiness with Geoffrey Warnock. She had loved that fiery spirit. Her love had been conquered by a mind stronger than her own, and she had submitted, almost as a slave submits to her captor. Mentally she had been in bondage, able to see all that was faulty and perilous in the character of her conqueror, yet loving him in spite of his faults. But to-day his image was associated with the great terror, a terror of undiscovered crime, the fear that when next she heard his name spoken, she would hear of him as an arrested criminal, or as a suicide, self-slaughtered in some quiet spot where the searchers must needs be slow to find him. 2:00. She had tried all her best-loved books in the endeavour to forget the dark realities of life, but books did not help her to-day. She never went into the dining-room for a formal luncheon when her father was out for the day, preferring some light refreshment of the kind which one hears of in Miss Austen's novels as the tray, a modest meal of cake and fruit, with nothing more substantial than a sandwich. To-day even the sandwich was impossible. Her lips were dry with an inward fever. Her hands were cold as ice. Her forehead was burning. Was it raining? She asked the servant. No, the rain had ceased an hour ago, the man told her. She started up with a feeling of relief at the idea of escape from the dull, silent house, put on her hat and jacket, and went out of the glass door into the garden, where the mild winter had left a few flowers, pale Dijon roses amidst the thick foliage of honeysuckle and magnolia on the south wall, a lingering chrysanthemum here and there in a sheltered bend of the shrubbery. The air was full of the sweetness of herbs and flowers, and the freshness of the rain. Yes, it was a relief to be walking about, looking at the shrubs, shaking the rain from the feathery branches of the deodars, searching for late violets behind a border of close-clipped box. It was a comfortable, old-fashioned garden, full of things that had been growing for the best part of a century, a garden of broad gravel walks and square grass plots, espaliers hiding asparagus beds, the scent of sweet herbs conquering the more delicate odours of violets and rare roses, a dear old garden to be happy in, and a quiet retreat in which to walk alone with sorrow. Suzette walked alone with her sorrow for nearly an hour, thankful for the hazard which had carried her energetic aunt to Salisbury 2 days before, on a visit to her friends in the Close, and had thus spared her Mrs. Mornington's society on this particular day. To have been comforted, to have been bewailed over, would have added to her burden. To walk alone in this dull old garden was best. Not alone any more. She heard the rustling of branches at the other end of the long green alley, and a footstep, a heavier footfall than Betsy Edgefield's, on the moist gravel. Her heart throbbed with a startled expectancy. Joy or fear? She had no time to know which feeling predominated before she saw her lover coming quickly towards her. He was dressed, not as she had been accustomed to see him, in the corduroy waistcoat, short tweed coat, and knickerbockers of rustic out-of-door life, but in a frock-coat, light grey trousers, and white waistcoat, and was wearing a Sunday hat. She had time to note these details, and the Malmaison carnation in his coat, and the light gloves which he was carrying, before he was at her side, looking down at her with wild, bloodshot eyes, grasping her arm with a strong hand, while those smart lavender gloves dropped from his unconscious grasp, and fell on the wet gravel, to be trampled underfoot like weeds. "Why were you not at the church? Why are you wearing that dingy frock? You and your bridesmaids ought to have been ready an hour ago. I've been waiting for you. Have you forgotten what this day means?" "Geoffrey, have not you forgotten? What madness to come back like this! What have you been doing with your life since the 14th of November? Where have you been hiding?" "Where? Hiding? Nonsense. I've been travelling. I took it into my head when Allen was coming back that you didn't care for me, that he was the favoured lover in spite of all. I had extorted your promise, and you were sorry you had ever given it, and I thought the best thing for me would be to make myself scarce, to go to Africa, Australia, anywhere. The world is big enough for two people to give each other a wide berth, but not big enough for Allen and me, if you liked him better than me. I was a fool, that's all. A fool to doubt my dearest. But there's no time to lose. We must be married before 3. Come to the church as you are. What does it matter? I've put on my war paint, you see. My valet seemed to think I was mad. You have seen your mother?" "Yes, she has been plaguing me with questions. I gave her the slip. Allen is there, in my house. The irony of fate, isn't it? Hovering between life and death, my mother told me. How long will he hesitate between two opinions? I left them wondering, and hurried to the church to meet you, only to find emptiness. No one there, not even the sexton. But there is still time. We can be married, you and I, with the sexton and pew opener for witnesses, and can start for the other end of the world to-night. Geoffrey, why did you go away?" she asked, looking up at that wild face, with infinite terror in her own. The restless eyes, the convulsive working of the dry, hot lips told their story only too plainly, the story of a mind distraught. "Dear Geoffrey," she said gently, with unspeakable pity for this human wreck, "there can be no marriage to-day. We are all in great trouble about Allen." "About Allen? Always about Allen?" he interrupted savagely. "What has Allen to do with the matter? It is our wedding day, yours and mine. I don't want Allen for my best man." "There can be no marriage while Allen is ill, lying in your house, so nearly murdered, perhaps even yet to die from that cruel usage. They are looking for his murderer, Geoffrey. Was it wise for you to come back to this place, knowing that?" "Knowing what?" "That Allen's mother is determined to find the man who so nearly killed her son. What have I to do with her determination? I shall neither hinder nor help her." Oh, the crafty smile, the malice and the cunning in that face, a look which Suzette had never seen till now, a look which made that once splendid countenance seem the face of a stranger. She shrank from him involuntarily. He saw the sudden look of repulsion, and tightened his grasp upon her arm until she gave a cry of pain. "Did I hurt you?" loosening his grasp with a laugh. "What a fluttering little dove it is, so easily scared, so easily hurt. Come, Suzette, you are not going to cheat me, are you? This is the 13th of December. Do you hear? The 13th, the date fixed and appointed by you, by your very self. You shall not evade your own appointment. Come, love, come." He took a few rapid steps forward, dragging her along with him, lifting her off her feet in his vehemence, but stopping suddenly when he found she was nearly falling. "Geoffrey, how rough you are." "I didn't mean to be rough, but there's not a moment to lose. Why won't you come?" "I am not coming. It is sheer madness to talk of our wedding. You have been away for a whole month of your own accord. Our marriage has been put off indefinitely. Poor Geoffrey," looking at his haggard face with sudden tenderness, "how dreadfully ill you look, worse than the night you arrived from Zanzibar. I will go back to the Manor with you, and see you safe and at rest with your dear mother." "No, no, I am never going back to the Manor where that dead man lies." "Dead? Oh, God, he is not dead. What do you mean?" "I don't want their dead man there." "Well, he may live, perhaps. I don't want him there. His presence poisons my house, as his influence has poisoned my life. He has been a blight upon me. Like me, they say. Like me, but of a different fibre. I know how to fight from my own hand. Will you come with me to the church, quietly, of your own accord?" "No, no, impossible." "Then I'll make you," he cried savagely, seizing her in his arms. "I won't be fooled. I won't be cheated. I'm here to fulfill my part of the bond. I've not forgotten the date." Then with a swift change of mood, he loosened his angry hold upon her, fell on his knees at her feet, crying over the poor little hand, which he clasped in both his own. "Pity me, Suzette, pity me. I am the most miserable wretch in the world. I have been wandering about England like a criminal. A hateful country, no solitude, people staring and prying everywhere. A miserable, overcrowded place where a man cannot be alone with his troubles, where there is no space for thought or memory. But I did not forget you. Your image was always there, touching his forehead. That never faded. Only I forgot other things, or hardly knew which were dreams or which were real. That grey afternoon in the wood, and the words that were said, and his face when I struck him. A dream? Yes, a dream. And then only yesterday the date, upon a newspaper seen by accident. I have read no newspaper since I left Discombe. Reminded me of to-day. I was at Padstow yesterday afternoon, an out-of-the-way village on the Cornish coast, and it has taken me all my time to get here to Discombe to-day in time to dress for my wedding. You should have seen my servant's face when I rang for him. I went into the house by the old door in the lobby, and walked up to my dressing-room without meeting a mortal. One never does meet any one at Discombe. The house is like the tomb of the Pharaohs, long passages, emptiness, silence. He had risen from his knees at Suzette's entreaty, and was walking by her side, walking fast, speaking with breathless rapidity, eager, self-absorbed, holding her lightly now by the arm as they paced the gravel walk. Higson was always a fool. I could see what he was thinking when I made him put out my frock-coat. The fellow thought I was mad. He wanted me to take a warm bath and lie down for a bit before I saw my mother. He talked in the smooth, wheedling way common people talk to lunatics, as if they were children, and then he ran off to fetch my mother, and she came, poor soul, and kissed and cried over me, and thanked God with one breath for my return, and with the next wailed about Alan. Alan was there, close by, in my room. I was not to speak above my breath, lest I should disturb him. I went to another room to dress, but I had ever so much trouble with Higson before I could get the things I wanted. London things, he called them, and wouldn't I have this or that, anything except what I asked for. So you see I had a lot of trouble, and then I walked to the church and found it was 2:00, and not a soul there. Geoffrey, what could you expect? I expected you to keep your word. This is our wedding day. I expected to find my bride. We must wait, Geoffrey. There is plenty of time. No, there is no time. I want to take you with me to the great lake, far away from this cramped, narrow country, these teeming, overcrowded cities, a soil criss-crossed with railways, shut in with streets and houses, not one wide horizon like that inland sea. Ah, how you would adore it as I do, in storm or in calm, always beautiful, always grand, a place made for the mind to grow in, for the heart to rest in. Ah, how often in the deep of the moonlight nights I have wandered up and down those smooth sands, thinking of you, conjuring up your image in such warm reality that it froze my blood when I looked round and saw that the real woman was not at my side. You will go to Africa with me, Suzette. Yes, dear, yes, by and by. Ah, that's what Higson said when I told him to put out a frock-coat, by and by. But I answered with a now. That made him jump. Hark, there's someone coming, a step on the gravel, a light step, a girl's quick footfall. It was the vicar's daughter, fresh and blooming, in winter frock and winter hat, a creature of the kind that is usually nailed flat on a barn door, with coiled gracefully round the little felt hat, pretending to have come from Siberia. At the sight of Geoffrey she started and looked aghast. "Mr. Warnock, I thought you were hundreds of miles away." "So I was yesterday afternoon, but I happened to remember my wedding day, and here I am, only to find that other people had forgotten." "Oh, you happen to remember," said Bessie, still staring at the white waistcoat, the Malmaison carnation, the light grey trousers stained with rain and mud from the knee downwards, and worst of all, the haggard countenance of the wearer. "You only remembered yesterday? How funny!" Miss Edgefield would have made the same remark about a funeral in her present startled condition of mind. Matcham had plenty of stuff for conversation within the next few days, for by that subtle process by which facts or various versions of facts are circulated in a rustic neighbourhood, people became aware of Geoffrey Warnock's return to Discombe, and of dreadful scenes that had occurred at Marsh House, where he had stayed for a couple of days, during which period Suzette was living at the Grove under her aunt and uncle's protection. Yes, there had been scenes, tragical scenes, at Marsh House. Mrs. Warnock had been hastily summoned there, and had stayed under General Vincent's roof till her unhappy son was removed in medical custody, whither Matcham people knew not, though there were positive assertions as to locality on the part of the more energetic talkers. A physician had been summoned from London, a man of repute in mental cases, and Mrs. Warnock's brougham had driven away from Marsh House in the wintry dusk with a pair of horses, and had not returned to the Manor till late on the following day, whereby it was concluded that the journey had been at least 20 miles. Mr. Warnock had been taken away, placed under restraint, people told each other, arriving at the fact by the usual inductive process, and on this occasion unhappily accurate in their deduction. Geoffrey was in a doctor's care, a madman with lucid intervals, not violent except in brief flashes of angry despair, but with occasional hallucinations, that delirium without fever which constitutes lunacy from the standpoint of law and medicine. Before he passed into that dim underworld of the private lunatic asylum, he had admitted in more than one wild torrent of self-accusation his treacherous desertion of Allen in Africa, his savage assault upon Allen in the wood. They had met, and Allen had upbraided him for that treacherous desertion and for stealing his sweetheart. Suzette's name had been like a lighted fuse to an infernal machine, and then the latent savage which is in every man had leaped into life, and there had been a deadly struggle, a fight for existence on Allen's part, a murderous onslaught from Geoffrey. It needed not the opinion of experts from Scotland Yard, nor yet the discovery of Allen's watch and signet ring under the rotten leaves in the deep hollow of an old oak, half a mile from the spot where he himself had been found, to substantiate Geoffrey's self-accusation. His unhappy mother, who was with him at Marsh House throughout those last dreadful hours of raving and unrest, had never doubted his guilt from the time of his reappearance at Discombe. It was months before Allen returned to the world of active life, but he left the Manor long before actual convalescence. Not once during those slow hours of returning health did he allude to the cause of his terrible illness. In on his mother timidly questioning him, he professed to have no recollection of the assault which had been so nearly fatal. Let the past remain a blank, mother. No good can come by trying to remember. He was especially gentle and affectionate to Mrs. Warnock on her rare visits to his room during the earlier stages of his convalescence. Geoffrey's name was not spoken by either, but Allen's sympathetic manner told the unhappy mother that he knew her grief and pitied her. Lady Emily was by no means ungrateful for the lavish hospitality with which Mrs. Warnock's house and household had been devoted to her son, yet she shrank with a natural abhorrence from a scene which was associated with Allen's peril and Geoffrey's crime. No kindness of Mrs. Warnock's could lessen that horror, and Lady Emily did her utmost to hasten the patient's removal to his own house, short of risking a relapse. When she saw him established in his cheerful bedchamber at Beechhurst, she felt as if she had taken him out of a charnel house into the pleasant world of the living and the happy, a world to which Geoffrey Warnock was fated never to return. Quite hopeless was the verdict of medical authority. Mrs. Warnock left Discombe and was said to be living in complete seclusion, attended upon by 2 or 3 of the oldest of the manor servants, in a cottage near the private asylum, where his son was a prisoner for life. Before midsummer, Allen's health was completely restored, and mother and son left for Suffolk, for the pastures and pine woods, the long white roads and sandy commons, the wide horizons and large level spaces flooded with the red and gold of sunsets that are said to surpass the splendor of sunsets in more picturesque scenery. Lady Emily would have been completely happy in this quiet interlude, this tranquil pause in the drama of life, had not Allen talked of going back to Africa before the end of the year. "Why not?" he asked, when she remonstrated with him. "There is nothing for me to do in England, and Africa doesn't mean a lifelong separation, mother, or I would not dream of going there. Every year shortens the journey. 6 weeks, I think, Consul Johnstone called it, to Lake Tanganyika. If I go, I promise to return in less than 2 years. You would hardly have time to miss me in your busy days here." "Busy about such poor trifles, Ellen. Do you think my farm could fill the place of my son? If you were away, one great care and sorrow would fill every hour of my life. And think what an anxious winter I went through, a season of fear and trembling." This plea prevailed. He could not disregard the care and love that had been lavished upon him. No, he would not allow himself to be drawn back to that dark continent, which is said to exercise a subtle influence over those who have once crossed her far-reaching plains, and rested beside her wide waters, and lived her life of adventure and surprise. No, it was too soon for the son to leave his mother, she having none but him. He had done with love, but duty still claimed him, and he stayed. A quiet winter at Beechhurst with his mother to keep house for him, a good deal of hunting, and so much attention and kindly feeling from everybody in the neighbourhood that he could not altogether play the hermit. He was forced into visiting and into entertaining his friends, and Lady Emily was very happy in playing her part of hostess in the livelier circle of Matcham, while the shutters were closed at Fendyke, and the bailiff had full sway on the White Farm, allowed to do what he liked there, which was generally something different from what his mistress liked. Life was made easier for Allen that winter by the absence of Suzette, who was travelling with her father; easier and emptier, for the one presence which would have given a zest to life was wanting. He told himself that it was better so, better for his peace, since she could never be anything to him. The disappearance of his rival would make no difference in her feelings for Allen, for no doubt her affection for Geoffrey would only be strengthened by their tragical separation and her lover's miserable fate. If she should ever care for anyone else, it would be a stranger. Allen told himself in those long reveries, which the mere sight of a well-known garden wall, or the chimneys of Marsh House seen above the leafless elms as he rode past, could evoke, "She will never waste a thought upon me." Other people were more hopeful. Mrs. Mornington told her friends in confidence that her niece's acceptance of that unfortunate young man had been a folly, into which she had been entrapped by Geoffrey's dominant temper and by her passion for music. She never loved that unhappy young man as she once loved Alan Carew. "And now, no doubt, she and Mr. Carew will make it up and marry," said the confidante, male or female, as the case might be. "Not now, but some day, yes, perhaps," replied Suzette's aunt, with a significant nod. And the day came when Geoffrey Warnock's passionate heart was still for ever, had been still for more than 2 years, and when, to him at rest in the silence of the family burial place at Discombe, by the side of the mother who had only survived him by a few weeks, the sound of Suzette's wedding bells, the knowledge of Alan's happiness, could bring no pain. Alan's day came, long and late after years of patient waiting, when Suzette had attained the sober age of 26, but it was a day of cloudless happiness, which promised to last to the end of life. No fear of the future marred the joy of the present. The later love that had grown up in Suzette's heart for her first lover was too strongly based upon knowledge and esteem to suffer the shadow of change. The End. End of Chapter 37. End of Sons of Fire by Mary Elizabeth Braddon.